Hello and good evening to everyone. Well, afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Today we have a really important topic, and I have the pleasure of having with me Geert Vanden Bossche from Belgium. The difference is that Geert is truly an international vaccine developer, and he's here to share some very important and unique perspectives on where we are now in terms of the COVID pandemic. So, pleasure to have you here with me, Geert. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me, Philip.
Wonderful. Listen, I think the first thing that we have to clarify is that we have to explain you are someone who is in the vaccine development business, so to speak. What has that background been like?
Well, I have a background essentially in, as far as vaccines are concerned, in industry as well as in the non-for-profit sector. So I have been working with the Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, especially concentrating on vaccines for global health. And I've also been working with several different companies, vaccine companies, developing, of course, essentially prophylactic vaccines. And my main focus of interest has always been, in fact, the design of vaccines. So the concept, how can we educate the immune system in ways that are, to some extent, more efficient than we do right now with our conventional vaccines.
Right. And so, in effect, this is the area of work you've been in. You develop vaccines. You are as well working with the Ebola vaccine as well, one of the really dangerous viruses we have out there in the world. How does that work? Is that easy to do?
Well, I was not, let me be very clear, I was a coordinator of the Ebola program at Gavi. So we were interacting with several different vaccine companies that were developing Ebola vaccines, because it was important for Gavi to make the right choice, the right vaccine, in order, for this vaccine to be rolled out in the Western African countries that had this severe Ebola crisis back a number of years ago. So that was not, let's say, operational, practical work. This was more a role of coordination, but of course was also a role of assessing what would be the impact of using some of these vaccines in larger populations and in an area where an epidemic is going on, because that's a very particular and peculiar situation.
Yes. And so, in effect, we've had so much success over the past 100 years with some very big breakthroughs with vaccines, smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella, polio. But we've struggled with other vaccines. Without going into the details, because this is very difficult to get across. But is there a difference with how viruses operate that make some easier to get a vaccine for?
Well, I think we have, Philip, essentially we need to distinguish, of course, between what we call acute self-limiting diseases. These are diseases that naturally come to an end, in a sense that ultimately the individual will eliminate the pathogen. Of course, some people may die, of course, let's be very clear. But those who survive will ultimately eliminate the pathogen. That is the vast majority of the vaccines we have been developing so far. I don't need to tell you that with other viruses, where we clearly see that they spread in a completely different way. They spread, for example, from cell to cell. They tend to be more intracellular. They tend to develop chronic infections where it's not self-limiting. It's not acute self-limiting. It's chronic. It is much more difficult, and that is the reason primarily is that most of the vaccines we are developing are still antibody-based vaccines. So we need these antibodies in the blood, or we need these antibodies to translate to the mucosa, for example, in order to capture the pathogen and to neutralize it. So some of the other bugs, they have a very insidious strategy, in a sense that they hide in cells that they can already at the mucosal barrier penetrate, immediately into cells, and then the cells may migrate, for example, to the lymph nodes. So they are shielded from the antibodies, and that makes it very, very difficult. Because we know that we can catch them to some extent in the blood, but what they do all the time is that they insert mutation and they fully escape to our antibody responses. So that makes it way more difficult. It's also more or less the reason why also against cancer, etc., we have not been extremely successful with vaccines as, I would say, standalone therapy.
Yeah. Absolutely, yes. So it brings us into where we are with regards to COVID-19. Now, if we have 2020 vision at the moment, when we look back at the pandemic and where we started from, and I've always said that at the time when the pandemic started, when it got from China into Italy, into Europe, into the UK, I thought that the only way that we could manage this is to lock down and to prevent the spread of this very dangerous virus. We do have to stand back and see whether or not those decisions were correct. But as we said, hindsight is 2020. What would you say now, as we look back at the decisions we made then? Were we about on the right track? Did we make any mistakes?
Well, frankly speaking, from the very beginning, and I mean, there is many people who can witness this or testify this, I always said that it was a bad idea to do lockdowns that would also affect the younger people, that we would prevent younger people from having contact, from being exposed. Because remember, the big difference back then was, of course, that we had a viral strain, COVID strain, that was circulating, dominant strain, and that was not highly infectious as those that we are seeing right now. Of course, when a new virus gets into a population, it immediately gets to the folks that have, weak immunity. And we know these people. This is to a large majority, of course, elderly people that have underlying diseases or are otherwise immune suppressed, etc. And of course, I mean, it was certainly the right thing to do to protect these people and for them also to isolate. But we have to distinguish, frankly speaking, and that is what we have not been doing, between those people that have strong innate immunity. I mean, it's not, you cannot see, when you see a person, you don't know this, but we know that young people have quite decent innate immune response. And therefore, they are naturally protected. And even more, I mean, if they get in contact with coronavirus, it will boost their natural immunity. So therefore, from the very beginning, I disapproved, the fact that schools got closed and universities, and that youngsters were preventing even from having contact with each other. That situation is, of course, completely different if you look at vulnerable people. The virus comes in the population. There is no humoral immunity. There is no immunity at all, in fact. So nobody has been in contact. So the youngsters, they can rely on good innate immunity. Elderly people, I mean, the innate immunity is waning. It gets increasingly replaced by antigen-specific, by specific immunity as people get older. So these people very, very clearly needed to be protected. But it has taken a lot of time before we understood, in fact, how exactly the immune response and the virus were interacting. So there has been a lot of confusion, a lot of mistakes made. Mistakes, I mean, retrospectively. And that has also led to, bad control right from the beginning, I would say. And,
so with that in mind, and where we are now, as we are, as countries across the world have been drifting towards the Christmas period, there's still a rise in cases. Countries had to try and lock down, mask mandates, and so on. But we all had the hope that vaccines would come and break the cycle. This is where clearly now, from your expertise, you seem to have a different thought about how we should have been thinking about vaccines then and even now. What is your perspective?
Well, my perspective was and still is that if you go to war, you better make sure that you have the right weapon. And the weapon in itself can be an excellent weapon. And that is what I'm saying really about the current vaccines. I mean, it's just brilliant people who have been making these vaccines in no time and with regulatory approval and everything. So the weapon in itself is excellent. Question is this the right weapon for the kind of war that is going on right now? And there my answer is definitely no, because these are prophylactic vaccines, and prophylactic vaccines should typically not be administered to people who are exposed to high infectious pressure. So don't forget, we are administering these vaccines in the heat of a pandemic. So in other words, while we are preparing our weapon, we are fully attacked by the virus. The virus is everywhere. So that is a very different scenario from using such vaccines in a setting where the vaccinee is barely or not exposed to the virus. And I'm saying this because if you have a high infectious pressure, it's so easy for the virus to jump from one person to the other. So if your immune response, however, is just mounting, as we see right now with a number of people who get their first dose. They get their first dose, the antibodies are not fully mature, titers are maybe not very high, so their immune response is suboptimal. But they are in the midst of this war. While they are mounting an immune response, they are fully attacked by the virus. And every single time, I mean, this is textbook knowledge, every single time you have an immune response that is suboptimal, in the presence of an infection, in the presence of a virus that infects that person, you are at risk for immune escape. So that means that the virus can escape to the immune response. And that is why I'm saying that these vaccines, I mean, in their own right, are of course excellent. But to use them in the midst of a pandemic and do mass vaccination, because then you provide within a very short period of time the population with high antibody titers, so the virus comes under enormous pressure. I mean, that wouldn't matter if you can eradicate the virus, if you can prevent infection. But these vaccines don't prevent infection, they protect against disease. Because we are just, unfortunately, we look no further than the end of our nose. In a sense that hospitalization, that's all what counts, you know, getting people away from the hospital. But in the meantime, we are not realizing that we give all the time during this pandemic, by our interventions, the opportunity to escape to the immune system. And that is, of course, a very, very, very dangerous thing, especially if we realize that these guys, they only need 10 hours to replicate. So if we think that by making new vaccines and new vaccine against the new infectious strains, we are going to catch up. It's impossible to catch up. I mean, the virus is not going to wait till we have those vaccines ready. I mean, this thing continues. And as I was saying, the thing is, I mean, if you do this in the midst of a pandemic, that is an enormous problem. These vaccines are excellent, but they are not made for administration to millions of people in the heat of a pandemic. So that is my point.
So I've seen the question many times, and quite frankly, I get asked the questions. We're coming to a point where people are going to have to take these vaccines. So that looks as though it's the reality, either in the context of work or in the context of travel. Based on what you're saying, they're in a lose-lose situation. What does this mean?
Well, what does this mean is very clear. It's very clear what this is going to mean. So let's consider the consequences of this both at the population level and at an individual level. Because I would well understand if for the population it's maybe not the best thing to do, but on an individual level, it's still okay. Yeah, then that's not an easy question. But as a matter of fact, it's exactly the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, it is detrimental, both on a population level as on an individual level. And I'm telling you why. I think the population level, I explained you, we are increasingly facing highly infectious strains that already right now we cannot control, because basically what we are doing is that we are turning, when we vaccinate somebody, we are turning this person in a potential asymptomatic carrier that is shedding the virus. But at an individual level, I just told you that if you have these antibodies, and at some point, and I'm sure people can challenge me on this, but reality will prove it. I think we are very close to vaccine resistance right now. And it's not for nothing that already people start developing, new vaccines against the strains, etc. But what I was saying is that, okay, if you miss the shoot, okay, you could say nothing has happened. No, you are at the same time losing the most precious part of your immune system that you could ever imagine of, and that is your innate immune system. Because the innate antibodies, the natural antibodies, the secretory IgMs, will be outcompeted by these antigen-specific antibodies for binding to the virus. And that will be long-lived. That is a long-lived suppression, and you lose every protection against any viral variant or coronavirus variant, etc. So this means that you are left just with no single immune response. With it's none. Your immunity has become nihil. It's all gone. The antibodies don't work anymore, and your innate immunity has been completely bypassed. And this while highly infectious strains are circulating. So I mean, if that isn't clear enough, I really don't get it. And people, please do read my what I posted, because it's science. It's pure science, pure science. And as everybody knows, I'm a highly passionate vaccine guy, right? And I have no criticism on the vaccines. But please use the right vaccine at the right place, and don't use it in the heat of a pandemic on millions of people. We are going to pay a huge price for this. And I'm becoming emotional because I'm thinking of my children, of the younger generation. I mean, it's just impossible what we are doing. We don't understand the pandemic. We have been turning it in an artificial pandemic. Who can explain where all of a sudden all these highly infectious strains come from? Nobody can explain this. I can explain it, but we have not been seeing this during previous pandemics. During natural pandemics, we have not been seeing it, because at every single time the immunity was low enough so that the virus didn't need to escape. So back at the end of the pandemic, when things calmed down and there was herd immunity, it was still the same virus circulating. What we are now doing is that we are really chasing this virus. I mean, it becomes all, increasingly infectious. And I mean, this is just a situation that is completely out of control. So it's also, we are now getting plenty of asymptomatic shedders, people who shed the virus, because if they are vaccinated or they have even antibodies from previous disease, they can no longer control these highly infectious variants. So how does that come? Does anybody still understand the curves? I see all these top scientists looking at these curves, at these waves, like somebody else is looking at the currency rates at the stock market. All they can say is, oh, it goes up, it's stabilizing, it may go down, it may go up, etc. I mean, that is not science. They don't have any clue. They don't even know whether the curve is going to go up exponentially or whether it's going to go down or whatever. They're completely lost, and that is extremely scary. That has been the point where I said, okay, guy, you have to analyze, you have to, but these people are not listening. That is the problem.
So you are in effect putting your reputation on the line because you feel so passionately about this, because I guarantee you that no government, no health system is going to want to hear what you are saying. You're in effect almost giving fuel to the fire for an anti-vaxxer who doesn't
No,
want
no,
the vaccine.
no. Well, no, not yet, because I've clearly also addressed some emails from anti-vaxxers. I mean, I'm not interested, but I'm clearly telling them that it at this point, it's so irrelevant. Whether you're a pro-vaxxer or an anti-vaxxer, etc. It is about the science. It's about humanity, right? I mean, let's not lose our time now with criticizing people or I mean, anti-vaxxer. Okay, if you're not an anti-vaxxer, you could be a stalker. You could be, we like to stigmatize, because if you stigmatize people, you don't need to bother about them anymore. Oh, this guy's an anti-vaxxer. Okay, I mean, he's out of the scope. Oh, he's a stalker. He's out of the scope. I mean, that is a discussion that is completely irrelevant at this point. It's about humanity. And of course, I'm passionate. Of course, I mean, it's about your children. It's your family. It's my family. It's everyone, right? And it's simply, for me, I put everything at stake because I've done my homework, right? And this is simply a moral obligation, right?
Wow. I mean, there's very little one can say. As I said, when you position that you are in the business of developing vaccines,